I preached the sermon for St. Luke's Mount Albert on the verses from Matthew's Gospel in which Jesus calls Peter and the disciples to take up the cross. If you'd like to read the Gospel passage in full, you can find the link below this video. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. After Peter's moment of brilliant clarity, when he saw and named Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and Jesus names him as the rock on which he will build his church, there is a bit of a crash back to earth. To Peter's dismay, the Messiah is not a figure of triumph and power, but one who will draw the wrath of Jerusalem's elite down upon himself. From this point onwards in Matthew's Gospel, Jerusalem becomes the backdrop of the inevitable clash. One commentator put it like this: Jesus must suffer in Jerusalem because the center is always threatened by the margins, and the empire strikes back at those who will expose its injustice and promote an alternative empire. His suffering is the inevitable consequence of this collision course with the political, socioeconomic, and religious elite. But Peter is having none of that. He pulls Jesus aside to rebuke him. Appalled, "God forbid it, this must never happen to you." And suddenly, rather than a rock, a foundation for the future, Peter is now a stumbling block on Jesus' path. "Get behind me, Satan." It's a very confronting moment. And Jesus goes on to explain for the disciples what it means to be the Messiah, the Christ, and what it means to acknowledge him as the Christ. "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and follow me and take up their cross. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." Jesus' words sound harsh to us, as I'm sure they did to Peter and the others with him. It's very hard for us to sit back and be a kind of comfortable audience watching this exchange. It's as if Jesus is saying, if I am the Christ, the Messiah, then this is who I am. And if I am Christ for you, then this is the pattern you are called to live by. These are my footsteps. Jesus isn't very interested here in sorting out right belief, orthodoxy, we call it. For Peter to say that Jesus is the Christ is irrelevant. If Peter, if the disciples, if ourselves don't then live in those footsteps, live in the pattern of the Christ. And that pattern is always the cross and the rising again, death and resurrection. Jesus' words about taking up the cross would have shocked his first listeners. For them, the cross was a symbol of Rome. It was an instrument of torture and oppression for those the Roman Empire stood over. Roman citizens weren't crucified unless guilty of treason. This particular form of state execution was reserved for foreign rebels and thieves and violent criminals. It was a shameful death and humiliating and agonizing. And so surely it was a scandalous and offensive thing for Jesus to suggest to his followers. Why did he go there? The point is that the cross was used as a way of erasing people, to crush them. But Jesus would not be ended in this way. The power of Rome, the empire, the great worldly power of his day was not limitless. Jesus would be raised on the third day. And in choosing to walk directly and freely into this fate at the hands of the Roman Empire, Jesus is refusing to participate in the effects of its power and its fear. And in this way, he profoundly destabilizes it. we were privileged to see the same kind of extraordinary refusal as the Muslim family members made their victim impact statements prior to the sentencing of the Christchurch shooter. For 3 days in the court in Christchurch, they faced him and they spoke their truth, their grief, their love, their loss, their anger and their forgiveness. All of it, pain and faithfulness in the mix too. And in all of that, he did not hold power over them anymore. They refused to be bowed down by his acts of terror and violence. Even in their suffering, they refused to let him be the end of them. They refused to participate in his system of hatred and white supremacy. Like Peter, we are quick to get hung up on Jesus' words about suffering and death. It's easy for us to forget that the greater trajectory of his being is through those things and always towards the third day, the rising again, towards real life, abundant living, towards freedom. Our fear of suffering and death and of the powers of this world can rob us of life, because fear of death easily turns into fear of life. It pushes us into stingy, cautious ways of living that are not really living at all. Though I need to say here also that Jesus' suffering and death were his way of offering his life fully, and he did it out of his own free will. So anyone who uses this text about taking up one's cross in order to force someone to accept that suffering is a good thing in and of itself is abusing Jesus' words. So paradoxically, perhaps, in calling us to take up the cross, Jesus is calling us to be more alive, to give of ourselves fully, to turn from our selfish, fearful selves and become giving selves instead, which is the way he lived, completely on his own terms of freedom and life and grace, rather than being defined by the world's terms of power and control and fear and oppression. If we sought to follow Jesus Christ in those footsteps, in that pattern, if we sought to live with that kind of total generosity and fearlessness in our lives, as parents and grandparents, professionals, as partners, as friends, if we lived with that passion and faith right where we are, in our own selves, in our own skins, live in such a way that we refuse to be bowed down or defined by the powers and terrors of this world, live always towards the rising of the third day, who knows what would happen? Amen. Thanks for listening. See you again next time.